This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay, thank you. We could begin our second panel of the morning. We have two speakers, Amanda Sives and Karen Hunt. Our first speaker is Amanda Sives, who is from the University of Liverpool. Dr. Sives is an experienced researcher who's worked on a number of different projects in Commonwealth countries, including Botswana, Guyana, Jamaica, South Africa, and Sri Lanka. Teaching and research interests include Latin and Caribbean politics, elections and conflict and politics and development. Her regional specialism is the Caribbean, and she's recently researched and published articles on Jamaican politics in a collection of Latin American perspectives and Commonwealth and comparative politics. Her most recent publication is a book entitled Elections, Violence and the Democratic Process in Jamaica in the period 1944 to 2007. And Dr. Sives' talk this morning will be on reconstructing citizenship from empire to nation to diaspora.
So is that moment of anxiety? Okay, thank you very much to everybody and to the organisers for the opportunity to speak to you today. This is a project, or as a paper, that really has emerged from three different projects that I've been looking at over the last few years. The first one was to look at I was looking at the initiative of the Jamaican government from 2004 to formalise its relationships and links with the diaspora. The second one was my interest in elections. In 2007 I was in Jamaica for the election and followed the debates afterwards about the constitutional issues around dual citizenship and the rights of people to stand as representatives for the Jamaican Parliament, House of Representatives. And the third project was a paper that I wrote at the end of 2010 for the Association of Commonwealth Universities, which was looking at the idea of Commonwealth citizenship. And so all of these kind of different directions kind of came together really in thinking about how is citizenship constructed and understood at different moments in the political history of a nation. And I'm using the word citizenship in a very specific way to frame the paper today, and that's to focus really on the political aspects of representational rights, both to vote in an election, but also to stand as either an MP or a senator. So I'm not getting into any of the wider debates, which are huge, about the meanings of citizenship. I really want to focus on that idea of voting and representation. So in a sense, the key question of the paper is what factors determine how the state decides who should have representational rights in a political system. What I'm going to do in the paper is start by looking at the construction of citizenship during empire and how that related to Jamaica, and then examine the transitions to independence in 1962, particularly looking at the Constitution, and then finally ending up looking at the current discussions and debates around the diaspora. So I was very interested in the High Commissioner's points this morning about the process of independence and the questions that came from that. So first of all, miraculously this seems to have moved on its own. The first three kind of issues I've been thinking about in terms of thinking about why is it that the 1962 Constitution in Jamaica allows Commonwealth citizens certain rights. Maybe think about all those processes of colonialism, of empire, and of independence. And the first point, I guess, I thought about when I think about the other parts of the British Empire is that the Caribbean, as we know, was colonised for such a very, very long period of time. And that process of colonisation decimated the indigenous populations of the island, and through the brutal processes of slavery, brought different population groups to the islands of the Caribbean. And that in a sense, there was a lack of a shared national identity through that process of colonialism. The only overarching framework that existed was that everybody, although very unequally, were members of the British Empire. And so that identity process formation during the period of colonialism is very much about being members, citizens or subjects of a British Empire. The second point connected to that is really that idea of citizenship and subject status within the British Empire itself. We know that in 1948, under the British Nationality Act, that every person, and we have has a mind of its own, every person who's a member of UK and the colonies has equal status, as we see here, status of a British subject. So that's codified through the British Nationality Act in 1948. But what that also reinforced, in a sense, was that prior to this codification is that sense of being a subject of empire that's used through Jamaican history by those who are colonised. I see Gad is here in the audience, has written a lot about these issues. But, for example, in 1865, Paul Bogle calls on the governor during the Morant Bay Rebellion to protect Her Majesty's, or is it His Majesty's? His Majesty's loyal subjects. So there's a use by those to kind of appeal to the British Crown to form some kind of protection. Her Majesty. Thank you. I show it. There we are. Obviously not a particular royalist. Thank you very much. And the third point here is really connected to the processes of independence. So we have a long period of colonisation. We have, I'm arguing, a sense of identity through empire, however kind of constructed that is. And finally, we have a process of independence. So we talked a bit this morning about that, the nature of that process of independence. We know from the work that's been done that this was a gradual process, it was an elite-led process, and although, quite rightly, there were people demanding independence within the Jamaican society, essentially this was a process that wasn't a mass nationalist movement and didn't signify a huge rupture. Right? So the language was not so much about being free from the British Empire, it was much more of a smooth, gradual transition from internal self-government into a process of full independence. So these arguments I'm making really, and I've got the quote here from Norman Manley, one of the fathers of the nation, really justifying the fact that this was the way that Jamaica would move into independence. That there was no need for a novel exercise in constitution building or anything original, because what was already there that the British had brought through the Westminster model and those processes of politics were the politics that worked in Jamaica, and there was no need for any radical change. So the argument really is that there's a very smooth transition from empire into nationhood during the period of the late 1950s and into the 1960s. And I'm arguing essentially that these factors might help us to understand why Jamaica and other Caribbean islands that followed her into independence kind of kept that connection with the idea of empire/Commonwealth, and that representational rights weren't directly connected to a sense of nationality, but they were connected to an idea of nationality plus, which was plus being the Commonwealth kind of connections. And I'm a little bit tenuous about this, and I've been trying to find in the papers, in the Kew Gardens at the National Archives, I've looked through the Colonial Office papers to see what was the correspondence going back and forth about the Constitution and the creation of the Constitution, and there is nothing in the Colonial Office papers about this aspect of Commonwealth citizens being given access to vote. So I am kind of putting forward a tentative explanation to try and understand why it is that the Constitution of the Caribbean, most of the constitutions of the Caribbean enshrine this right for Commonwealth citizens. So I know we talked about it a bit this morning, but just to clarify what the Constitution currently says, as we can see here, there's very little difference between the right to vote for Jamaicans and Commonwealth citizens. And as the High Commissioner pointed out this morning, Jamaicans abroad can vote as long as they have a residence and they're registered in Jamaica. But a Commonwealth citizen can also vote as long as they've been in the country for 12 months. I certainly wasn't aware of that when I lived in Jamaica myself. And the right to be elected is also an interesting one. There's no difference here between who can stand in an election in Jamaica. A Jamaican or a Commonwealth citizen is equally allowed to participate as a senator or as a member of parliament. And I think it was, now Prime Minister Portia Simpson-Miller who talks about the fact that there could be a Commonwealth citizen as the Prime Minister of Jamaica, given the way that the Westminster model actually functions. So the Constitution enshrines these rights for Commonwealth citizens. So then I assumed that if the Jamaican Constitution codifies these rights for Commonwealth citizens, maybe this is a feature of all Commonwealth constitutions, because essentially Britain allows these rights to Commonwealth citizens who live in Britain. But what's interesting about this is, having looked through all of the different constitutions of the Commonwealth, which I have to tell you wasn't a particularly exciting job, what we find is that it's mainly, with the exception of the United Kingdom and Mauritius, the Caribbean constitutions that give rights to Commonwealth citizens. And they are, if you can see in the list, the brackets after are how many years resident you need to be in the country before you can either vote or stand in a candidate, and obviously those are the upper or lower houses. So there are differences in the constitutions of the Caribbean about what your particular rights are, but, they all give rights to Commonwealth, at least Commonwealth citizens, to be able to vote. So it's an odd, it raises questions, and I don't think that I have a particular answer, but I think it's bizarre that these rights are only given in Commonwealth countries. There's been quite a number of historical analysis about the Commonwealth, but they tend to, interestingly, focus on the UK's relationship with what are known as the Old Commonwealth, the Old Dominions, Australia, Canada and New Zealand. And when I looked at those historical analyses to look at what were the citizenship issues for those countries, what we find is that there's a very clear distinction between who is, for example, Canadian, or who has rights in Canada, as opposed to Commonwealth citizens. So Caratini's book, which is written around the sort of time of the British Nationality Act, or looking at the period of the Nationality Act in 1948, argued that at that point, no other Commonwealth government actually shared Britain's views about citizenship, i.e. that the Commonwealth citizens should have all kinds of rights and votes and so forth, and did not grant citizenship rights and privileges to Commonwealth citizens. So we've got here a quote from the Canadian discussion about their act of citizenship, that people from India shouldn't be allowed to be part of Canada because or Canadian voting processes because they weren't Canadian citizens. So there's a very clear distinction made at this point between who had the right to representation and the forms of citizenship, and who didn't, and that was very clearly linked to nationality in this particular context. So the question is why that wasn't the case when the Caribbean islands become independent in the 1960s. And I guess part of the thinking I've been having about this idea of empire and Commonwealth is thinking about what did the Commonwealth mean in the late 1950s, 1960s? I mean, some people would ask, what does the Commonwealth mean now? But I think at the moment of the transition from empire into Commonwealth, we have this blurred kind of process going on. As the Commonwealth emerges from empire and is attempting to create an identity of its own. And we've got a really nice quote that I found here from a paper written in 1960 about Ghana. But it's the idea of this slippery definition of empire and Commonwealth at the end of the late 1950s and into the 1960s. So it's this idea of the empire becoming the British Commonwealth of Nations, and that becoming the Commonwealth of Nations, and that kind of connection at this moment between empire and Commonwealth and Britain, and those kinds of ties and important sort of ties being very important during this particular period. I'll just get that support. So essentially, what I was thinking about in terms of this transition into independence is that, and I think it's kind of been raised a little bit this morning, is thinking about those notions of nationhood and nationality at the moment of independence. and that this was a unformed or a burgeoning identity, and people have talked about the kind of creation of the cultural, the kind of cultural expansion after independence, and that real sense of becoming Jamaican and what that means to people. And I'm just interested to think about that late 1950s, early 1960s period. What did it mean then to be independent, and what did it mean to be Jamaican? And I suppose part of my questioning is whether these connections and these rights to the Commonwealth citizens reflected the ties to Britain that at that point was still extremely important and extremely strong, both economically and politically, and so forth. So that's the kind of position where I'm at in 1962 in terms of thinking about the Constitution. And the other thing I wanted to add is that I think there's a real irony that in 1962, when Jamaica is gaining independence and giving rights to Commonwealth citizens to participate in the political process in Jamaica, Jamaicans and other people from what the British called the new Commonwealth are being restricted from coming into Britain in 1962 with the passing of the Commonwealth Immigration Act. So Jamaica is giving rights to people from Britain and having them taken away at the same time by the British government. I think there's a certain irony in that. So secondly, I just want to go on to think about the modern discussion. I don't have time. Just over 5 minutes. I always am very good at timing these things. Okay, so coming on to the modern discussion, this idea of possibly of reconstructing citizenship into the 21st century. And as I said at the start, there were a couple of things that kind of interested me about these various debates, which we know haven't been resolved really. The first one is around the 2007 election and the dual citizenship issue. As we know, the PNP at that election were attempting a 5th term in office and lost by a very, very small margin. And while they accepted defeat, argued that a number of the candidates for the Jamaica Labour Party were not eligible to stand as candidates because they were dual citizens. The Constitution doesn't disallow dual citizens from taking part as a candidate in an election unless they have sworn, as you can see here, any acknowledgement of allegiance, obedience or adherence to a foreign power or state. And in the case of the four, it looks like a wanted poster. In the case of the 4 candidates on the screen, 3 had sworn allegiance to the United States and 1 to Venezuela. And also, the Jamaica Labour Party also counteracted this, arguing there were people in the People's National Party who had similarly sworn allegiance. So various long court cases went ahead, and it was found that actually they weren't eligible to stand as candidates and by-elections were held. But this raised this kind of anomalous position where Commonwealth people could have actually stood and been elected, whereas Jamaicans who had US dual citizenship were unable to. And this, I guess, became more significant in the context of the Diaspora initiative. Now, launched in 2004, very much, as was mentioned this morning, in recognition of the huge contribution that Jamaicans make to the Jamaican development and Jamaican society through remittances and lobbying and so forth. A real attempt to try and bring those activities together in a more formalised structure. But alongside of that kind of relationship, there were questions raised about the political issues, and we have the Joint Select Committee that was established, and the proposal by I think it was by Portia Simpson, Prime Minister Portia Simpson Miller in 2006, that there should be diaspora representation on the Senate, so that there was a direct political voice for the diaspora in Jamaican politics. And I think that possibly that proposal is still floating around. So it was a very interesting kind of moment in thinking about who has the right to participate in these processes. And we have a quote here from former Prime Minister Bruce Golding at the Diaspora Conference in 2008. Really recognising that the kind of, as he called it, the absurdity of this situation, that somebody from New Zealand could be a member of Parliament, but a Jamaican couldn't, who had dual citizenship. And I think this also has to be seen in the context of at certain moments, Jamaicans living in the United States being encouraged to take on dual citizenship in order to have a vote and political voice in the US political system. So it's a problematic kind of situation. And I wanted to just add to this to one more quote, because I think this is a really nice quote from the former minister. I think this is just a nice way of kind of thinking about this idea that when the Constitution was written, the Commonwealth was king. I'm not sure the Commonwealth's ever been king, but that notion of empire being the king, and that Britain ruled the world. And that's when the Constitution was written, and that's when those rights were being given to wider Commonwealth citizens. So I'll just read my conclusion, if that's okay. I guess what I'm saying is that 50 years on, it's time to look again, and clearly that's occurring, to look again at the constitutional arrangements which were set up under a very different new world order, under a time of a British Empire and a transition into independence. A time when the diaspora communities, whilst they were spread around different parts of the globe, were really very much in the UK. Now they're in the United States, and that's where the growing communities of Jamaicans overseas are really kind of locating. So thinking through their connections back to the homeland in more than just an economic aspect is something that I think is emerging in the discourse currently within Jamaica. So I'll just read this. What I've tried to present today is how this meaning of citizenship was constructed at a particular moment in time, and that it remains fluid and susceptible. And although we focused on the voting and representational rights, I think they're very important in thinking about who has a voice in the shaping of societies. And we've seen how that importance of kind of connection to empire was there as part of a colonial experience, and that this has changed over time, and that the political realities of the 21st century, in a very different kind of environment, have highlighted the anomaly of these particular rights for Commonwealth citizens, and particularly in the context of other dual citizens actually being precluded from holding political office. So in the moment of independence, the Jamaican political community, and I'm talking about the political community here, wasn't defined so much by nationality, but by nationality and residency and historical relationships, very much kind of formed through this idea of the Commonwealth. And that into the 21st century, that political community is being redefined, or it's certainly being very strongly questioned, about who within the nation, when we talk about the nation, not just within the boundaries of the state, but in other parts of the world, within the nation, who should have the right to have a voice in the way in which Jamaica develops. And I was interested that the High Commissioner mentioned this morning that people can have the right to vote if they have a residency in Jamaica. But I suppose there are questions about those who don't have a residency in Jamaica, those who may be second, third generation Jamaicans. There are all kinds of very difficult questions, definitely, around this subject, and I don't have any answers, but I think it's just quite interesting to try and question how those kind of meanings and how those rights are really constructed and understood. Okay, thank you.